A doorbell camera records a figure standing at the front door. Inside the house, a 70-year-old woman is about to disappear forever. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. Within hours, ransom notes arrive. The FBI demands proof she's alive. That proof never comes. 86 days pass. No arrests. No suspects named. But here's what makes this case different. The greatest threat to finding Nancy wasn't the kidnapper. It was the sheriff investigating her disappearance. While a reality TV crew filmed inside his department, while experienced detectives were removed from homicide for political revenge, while critical DNA evidence sat untested for 2 months because he refused to send it to the FBI, Nancy Guthrie's chance at survival slipped away. This is the story of how a woman was kidnapped from her own home, and how the people sworn to protect her were too busy protecting their own careers to bring her home alive. Before we go further, if you're interested in deep investigations into cases like this, cases where the system fails and the truth gets buried under politics and ego, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Files. We stay on these stories long after the headlines fade. This is the story of how a reality television show, a sheriff hungry for publicity, and a series of decisions that defy explanation may have cost Nancy Guthrie her life. Let's start with what we know for certain. Nancy Guthrie lived in Catalina Hills, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Tucson. The kind of place where people know their neighbors, where doorbell cameras are common because residents tend to be older and safety conscious. Nancy was in her 70s, living independently, going about her life like thousands of other retirees in southern Arizona. There was nothing about her that suggested she would become the center of one of the most baffling and controversial missing persons cases in recent memory. But on one particular night, everything changed. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. We know this because her doorbell camera recorded someone at her front door. That footage would eventually become the only confirmed visual evidence investigators had. The person in that video has never been publicly identified. No name, no arrest. Just a face on a screen, and a woman who disappeared into the desert darkness. Within hours of Nancy's disappearance, her family realized something was catastrophically wrong. The Pima County Sheriff's Office was notified. The FBI joined the investigation almost immediately, which tells you something important. The federal government doesn't step in unless there's reason to believe a crime crosses state lines or involves specific federal violations. Kidnapping qualifies. And this was clearly a kidnapping, because soon after Nancy vanished, the ransom notes began to arrive. Multiple notes came in. Law enforcement has stated publicly that they believe the initial communications were genuine. Someone had taken Nancy Guthrie and wanted money for her return. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It wasn't a random home invasion gone wrong. This was planned. Someone targeted Nancy, took her from her home, and demanded payment. But here's where the case takes its first dark turn. The FBI and Nancy's family did exactly what they're supposed to do in a kidnapping for ransom. They demanded proof of life. Show us Nancy is alive. Let us hear her voice. Give us something that proves she's okay, and that negotiation is even possible. It's standard protocol. You don't pay a ransom without confirmation that the victim is still alive, because once that money changes hands, there's no leverage left. No reason for the kidnappers to keep their word. The proof of life never came. Think about what that means. Someone took a 70-year-old woman from her home, wrote ransom notes, initiated contact, and then went silent the moment they were asked to prove she was still alive. Either they couldn't provide that proof, or they wouldn't. And if they couldn't, there's only one reason why. Nancy Guthrie was likely already dead. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore, who has decades of experience working kidnapping cases, put it bluntly. The kidnappers broke the first rule of ransom. They lost their bargaining chip. Without Nancy alive, they had nothing to trade, no reason for anyone to pay, no way to complete the transaction. And now, instead of facing kidnapping charges with the possibility of release and financial gain, they're facing murder charges with no benefit whatsoever. They screwed up. And that mistake, according to experts, is why the communication stopped, why the case went cold, why 86 days have passed without resolution. But this story isn't just about kidnappers who made fatal errors. It's about what happened after Nancy disappeared. It's about the decisions made by the people who were supposed to bring her home. And that's where things get disturbing. Let's talk about the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Specifically, let's talk about what they were doing in the months leading up to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. While crime continued across Pima County, while detectives handled investigations and deputies responded to calls, the leadership of the sheriff's office was busy with another project. They were working with A&E Network on a reality television show. The plan was simple. Camera crews would follow deputies around, document their daily work, show the public what law enforcement really looks like on the ground. Shows like this aren't new. They can be valuable. They humanize officers. They show the difficulty and danger of the job, but they also require time, resources, and cooperation from a department that's supposed to be focused on keeping people safe. Fox Digital submitted a public records request and obtained hundreds of emails exchanged between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and producers from Entin. Those emails reveal the extent of coordination required to make a show like this happen. Producers requested access to body camera footage. They asked for interviews with heads of departments. They wanted ride-alongs and behind-the-scenes access to ongoing operations. And the sheriff's office complied. They sent videos back and forth. They scheduled interviews. They rearranged personnel to accommodate filming. But here's what makes those emails particularly revealing. When producers asked to interview the heads of the homicide unit and the cold case unit, they were told there had been some scheduling issues. The reason given? The department has experienced rotational reassignments since last year. The head of the cold case unit had been moved out. The head of the homicide unit had been moved out. New people were in those positions. People with less experience. People who hadn't been leading those units when the reality show planning began. At the time, that probably seemed like a minor administrative detail to the producers, just a scheduling conflict. But knowing what we know now, those words, rotational reassignments, carry a much darker implication. Because after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, and after questions started being raised about how the investigation was being handled, the truth about those reassignments came to light. The sheriff had removed experienced investigators from critical leadership positions. The people who had been running homicide and cold case investigations, people with years of expertise, were taken out of those roles and replaced, and according to multiple sources, the reason wasn't performance. It wasn't some strategic reshuffling to improve efficiency. It was political retaliation. These were people who hadn't supported the sheriff during his election. So when he won, he moved them out. Rotational reassignments, that's what they called it. But what it really meant was that when Nancy Guthrie was kidnapped, the people who should have been leading the investigation, the people with the most experience handling exactly this kind of case, were gone. Steve Moore didn't mince words when asked about the impact of those leadership changes. He said if the experienced people were still in those roles, we'd be in a different place now with the Nancy Guthrie investigation. He couldn't say for certain the case would be solved, but he was confident they would be way farther down the road. Possibly solved. Let that sink in for a moment. A 70-year-old woman is kidnapped from her home. Ransom notes are sent. She's likely dead within days. And the people best equipped to investigate, to follow leads, to make the critical decisions that might have brought her home or caught her killers, aren't in charge anymore. Because they didn't support the right candidate in an election. We'll never know for certain if those experienced investigators would have made the difference. But we do know this. When you remove expertise from critical positions, you create gaps. You slow things down. You increase the likelihood of mistakes. And in a kidnapping case, time is everything. Hours matter. Days matter. Every moment of delay gives kidnappers more opportunity to cover their tracks, to dispose of evidence, to disappear. So while the sheriff's office was coordinating with television producers, while emails were flying back and forth about body camera footage and interview schedules, while the sheriff himself was doing press conferences and media appearances, Nancy Guthrie's case was being handled by a homicide unit and a cold case unit led by people who were new to those roles. People who, through no fault of their own, simply didn't have the same level of experience as their predecessors. And the sheriff wasn't just participating in the investigation. He was down in the weeds, making specific decisions about evidence. We know this because of what happened with a single strand of hair. At the crime scene, investigators found a hair. It's not clear exactly where it was found or what made it significant, but it was collected as evidence. DNA evidence is often the key to solving cases like this. A hair can tell you who was at the scene. It can link a suspect to a victim. It can be the difference between an unsolved case and a conviction. The FBI asked to test that hair. They made the request 2 months before it was finally sent to their lab. 2 months. The FBI has some of the most advanced forensic technology in the world. Their lab can extract DNA from the smallest samples, run comparisons against national databases, and deliver results that hold up in court. When the FBI asks to test evidence in a case they're actively working, there's usually no question. You send it. You let them do their job. But the Pima County Sheriff's Office didn't send the hair to the FBI. Instead, they sent it to a private lab in Florida, 3,000 miles away. A lab that, by all accounts, has the same technology the FBI does, which raises an obvious question. Why? Steve Moore, who spent his career in the FBI, called it unheard of. He said if he were a sheriff and his homicide people refused to send evidence to the FBI lab, they'd have a conference to find out exactly why they felt the FBI's lab wasn't good enough for them. He described it as indicative of animosity between the sheriff and the FBI, and the FBI made that animosity public. In a highly unusual move, the FBI released a statement about the hair evidence. They said they were still receiving inquiries about it. They clarified that this was not new evidence or information. It was a hair that had been found during the initial investigation. Then came the pointed part. The FBI stated clearly that they had asked to test the DNA 2 months ago with the same technology they've always had, but the local sheriff instead sent it to a private lab. They finished by saying any further developments would be shared as soon as appropriate. Read between the lines of that statement. The FBI doesn't criticize local partners publicly unless something has gone seriously wrong. These are organizations that are supposed to work together. They share information, they coordinate operations, they support each other. For the FBI to release a statement that essentially calls out a sheriff for refusing their help, for delaying evidence testing by sending it across the country instead of to the lab right there, is extraordinary. And notice what else they did. They didn't use the sheriff's name. For an elected official, someone who benefits from name recognition and media presence, that's a deliberate slight. The FBI could have said Sheriff so-and-so made this decision. Instead, they said, the local sheriff, distancing themselves, making it clear this wasn't a joint decision or a collaborative choice. This was the sheriff's call, and it was the wrong one. Eventually, the hair was sent to the FBI lab. 86 days into this case, that evidence is finally being tested with the full capabilities of federal forensic science. But 2 months were lost. 2 months when that DNA could have been analyzed, compared, potentially linked to a suspect. 2 months when investigators could have been following leads generated by that evidence. Gone. Because the sheriff decided to send it to Florida instead. Steve Moore said it plainly. The sheriff is down in the weeds of this case, making decisions about whether or not to cooperate with the FBI on one little hair. If he's that involved in granular decisions, imagine what else he might have his fingers on. And this brings us back to the reality show. Back to those hundreds of emails. Back to the question of priorities. The sheriff is an elected official. Elections require name recognition, media presence, public perception, a reality television show featuring your department, showing your deputies doing heroic work, portraying law enforcement in a positive light. That's incredibly valuable for someone who has to run for re-election. It's free publicity. It's brand building. And according to people who have observed the sheriff's behavior, he seemed to be a fan of being on television. Press conferences, interviews, media appearances. He was visible. He was vocal. Steve Moore, again, didn't hold back. He said it's unsettling when someone in law enforcement gets involved in media attention and starts to like it, because when that happens, sometimes the primary responsibilities take a secondary role to getting your face on camera or getting positive reviews. He said it leaves a bad taste, more than kind of a bad taste. He believed there was somebody much more interested in doing things his way than the right way, and getting his face on camera instead of getting other people's faces on mugshots. That's a damning assessment from someone who has worked at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. And it points to a central tension in this case. Was the sheriff more focused on solving Nancy Guthrie's kidnapping or on managing his public image? Consider the timeline. Reality show being planned and filmed. Experienced investigators removed from leadership positions. Nancy Guthrie kidnapped. FBI joins investigation. Ransom notes arrive. Proof of life demanded, but never provided. Hair. Evidence found. FBI asks to test it. Sheriff sends it to Florida instead. 2 months pass. FBI releases critical public statement. 86 days go by without an arrest. At every decision point, there's a question. Would an experienced homicide leader have handled this differently? Would they have sent the hair to the FBI immediately? Would they have made different tactical choices in the early hours of the investigation when time was most critical? We can't know for certain, but we can know this. The decisions that were made didn't lead to Nancy Guthrie being found. They didn't lead to arrests. They didn't lead to justice. If you're finding this investigation as troubling as I am, if you think cases like this need to be covered even when they're uncomfortable, even when they implicate people in power, then please hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Files. We don't let these stories disappear just because they're inconvenient for the people involved. Now, let's talk about what investigators believe actually happened to Nancy Guthrie. The working theory, based on the evidence available and the pattern of communication, is that this was a kidnapping for ransom that went catastrophically wrong. Steve Moore explained it this way. These were amateur criminals, not professionals, not people who had done this before and knew how to manage a hostage situation. Amateurs who thought they could grab an elderly woman, demand money, and get away with it. But they made mistakes. Fatal mistakes. And the biggest one was losing their bargaining chip. Somewhere in the early hours or days after taking Nancy, something went wrong. Maybe she fought back and was injured. Maybe they panicked and it escalated to violence. Maybe she had a medical emergency and they couldn't or wouldn't get her help. Whatever happened, Nancy likely died before the kidnappers could complete the ransom transaction. And once she was dead, they were trapped. They couldn't provide proof of life. They couldn't complete the exchange. They couldn't get their money. And they couldn't let anyone know what had happened without facing murder charges. So the communication stopped. The ransom attempt fell apart. And Nancy Guthrie disappeared into the desert. That theory is supported by the fact that the ransom notes stopped coming after proof of life was demanded. It's supported by the silence, by the lack of negotiation, by the complete breakdown of what should have been an ongoing dialogue between kidnappers and law enforcement. But here's where the case gets even more complex. Was this one person or more? The doorbell camera footage shows one individual at Nancy's front door. That's the only confirmed visual evidence of a suspect. But does that mean this person acted alone? Experts are divided. Some believe it's entirely possible for one person to have abducted an elderly woman from her home. She was in her 70s. A single determined individual could have overpowered her, forced her into a vehicle, and taken her to a secondary location. History shows that kidnappings are sometimes carried out by lone actors, particularly when the victim is vulnerable. But others, including Steve Moore, think it's more likely there were at least 2 people involved. Statistically, kidnappings of adults tend to involve multiple perpetrators, and there's a practical reason for that. You can't live your normal life if you have a guest in your house who's trying to escape. If you're holding someone against their will, you need to watch them constantly. You can't go to work. You can't run errands. You can't sleep soundly. It's undoable with one person for any length of time. There's also the question of how this operation was structured. Some have theorized a boss and underling dynamic, a chef and a waiter, someone who planned it and someone who executed it. The person in the doorbell footage might not be the mastermind. They might just be the one who went to the door while someone else waited in a vehicle or stayed behind to coordinate. If there were multiple people involved, and if they made some kind of pact to never speak about what happened, does that usually hold? Steve Moore's answer was unequivocal. No, it will not stick for very long at all. Everyone has a risk tolerance. And in a situation like this, one person will have a lower tolerance than the other, which means they'll bail first. It's like playing chicken. Eventually, someone breaks. That offers a glimmer of hope in this case. If 2 or more people were involved, one of them might crack, might reach out to law enforcement, might try to cut a deal. The FBI knows this. They're waiting, watching, hoping that the pressure becomes too much for someone, and they decide cooperating is better than spending the rest of their life looking over their shoulder. But there's a darker possibility. What if the person in the doorbell footage isn't around anymore? What if the boss, assuming there was one, killed the underling to ensure silence? Steve Moore said he's aware of cases like that, though he's never worked one personally. It's possible, but it would suggest a much more violent, experienced criminal, someone who has killed before, someone who might have handled the kidnapping itself differently. And if that person disappeared, if they went missing in Tucson, their family and friends would notice. There would be a second missing persons case. The same sheriff's office would be investigating it. The connection would be obvious. So far, there's no indication of that, which means if there were multiple people involved, they're likely all still out there, still silent, still waiting to see if the investigation closes in. And that brings us to a critical question. What does the FBI really know that they're not telling us? The FBI operates under a very different philosophy than local law enforcement when it comes to public information. They're not a media company. They're an investigative and prosecutive organization. Their job is to build cases that hold up in court, not to satisfy public curiosity. Steve Moore was emphatic about this. The FBI wants to tell you everything about a case, but they want to tell you in trial. That's where the public has an absolute right to know. We have public trials. We don't have public investigations. So when the FBI releases information during an active case, it's only because they have to, because they need public help, because they've exhausted other options. The fact that they eventually released the doorbell camera images tells you they were desperate for leads. Kash Patel, a federal official, put those images out publicly. That doesn't happen unless investigators are stuck. But what else do they know? What evidence exists that hasn't been made public? Steve Moore said, if you could sit down and get briefed by 4 or 5 agents working the case, you'd find so much information that ultimately turned out to be of little or no value but seemed so promising at the time. Leads that went nowhere. Tips that didn't pan out. Evidence that looked significant but couldn't be connected to anything. All of that stays internal. Releasing it would light a fire on social media that wouldn't be helpful. It would generate noise without advancing the investigation. There's also the question of the white SUV. Early on, surveillance footage captured a white SUV in the area around the time of Nancy's disappearance. The sheriff's office said it was part of the investigation. They were looking into it. They reviewed thousands of vehicle images from traffic cameras. But we never heard anything more. No public appeal for information about the vehicle. No description. No request for owners of white SUVs to come forward. That absence is notable. In the Brian Kohberger case, the investigation into the Idaho student murders, the white Hyundai Elantra was a major break. Law enforcement put out a public call for information. They asked anyone who owned or had seen that specific vehicle to contact them. It worked. It led them to Kohberger. So why hasn't that happened here? Steve Moore said there are 2 possibilities. Either they don't have a solid vehicle identification, or they do have it, and they're not releasing it for strategic reasons. The FBI doesn't owe the public real-time updates. They release what needs to be released. If they have a vehicle and they know who owns it, they might be building a case quietly, watching, waiting for the right moment. Or they might genuinely have nothing. The white SUV might have been a dead end, just a vehicle passing through the area at the wrong time, unconnected to the crime. We don't know, and that's the point. The FBI holds information close. They operate in the dark, and we only find out what they knew when someone is arrested, and the case goes to trial. Which brings us back to the question of time. 86 days have passed, almost 3 months, and there's been no arrest, no named suspects, no significant public developments. The case appears to be stalled. But there's another angle to this story that adds yet another layer of dysfunction to an already troubled investigation. A volunteer organization called Kingen Navy came forward about a month before this episode. They're a group that organizes searches for missing persons. They have resources, drones, search dogs, trained volunteers. They've helped in other cases. They know what they're doing. and they wanted to help find Nancy Guthrie. But they didn't just show up and start searching on their own. They did it the right way. They submitted a formal plan to the Pima County Sheriff's Office. They asked for approval. They asked for guidance. They wanted to know where the Sheriff's Office wanted them to search. They wanted to coordinate, to be helpful without interfering, to bring resources to bear in a case where every possible lead needed to be followed. The sheriff ignored them. No response, no approval, no denial, no feedback, just silence. So Kinjin Navy tried again. They submitted a revised plan. They asked for feedback so they could adjust their proposal to meet the sheriff's requirements. They made it clear they weren't trying to undermine the investigation or grandstand. They genuinely wanted to help. Still no response. Steve Moore found this baffling. He asked what the downside was. Why not let them search? You already released the crime scene too early, he said. Now you're afraid they're going to trample on it again? He wasn't 100% confident they'd find anything, but he asked how letting them try would destroy society in the Tucson area. Show them some respect. They're willing to help. If there's a reason not to do it, say what it is. But not responding is counterproductive and disrespectful. He also pointed out something important. When you do aerial searches in the desert, you don't always find what you're looking for, but you find other things. He once participated in a search for a missing plane. They looked for 2 or 3 days. They found 5 planes, not ones people were still looking for, but wreckage from crashes that nobody even knew were still out there. The desert keeps secrets. A volunteer search might not find Nancy Guthrie, but it could find evidence in other cases, unsolved crimes, missing persons, remains that could bring closure to other families. So why wouldn't the sheriff accept the help? Steve Moore didn't rule out ego. He said he hoped that wouldn't be the case, but he couldn't dismiss it. It seemed to match some of the patterns. A sheriff who wants only his office to get credit, who doesn't want anyone else to have success, who sees a volunteer organization as competition rather than assistance. If that's true, if ego is driving decisions in this investigation, then Nancy Guthrie and her family are paying the price. Because while the sheriff protects his image and his department's reputation, a 70-year-old woman is still missing, her kidnappers are still free, and justice is still out of reach. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home 86 days ago. Someone came to her door. She was taken. Ransom notes arrived. The FBI and her family demanded proof of life. That proof never came. She is almost certainly dead. The people who took her are likely amateurs who made catastrophic mistakes. But they haven't been caught. The investigation has been hampered at nearly every turn. Experienced leaders were removed from critical positions before Nancy disappeared. The sheriff made decisions that delayed evidence testing and created conflict with the FBI. A reality television show consumed time and resources. Volunteers offering to help were ignored. And 86 days later, we're no closer to answers than we were at the beginning. The FBI is working the case. They have the hair evidence now. They're analyzing it. They're following leads we don't know about. They're waiting for someone to break, someone to talk, someone to make a mistake. But they're doing it while navigating a dysfunctional relationship with the local sheriff's office. They're doing it without the experienced homicide investigators who should have been leading from day one. They're doing it while the sheriff prioritizes his public image over cooperation, and Nancy Guthrie's family is waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for closure, waiting for someone to be held accountable. Steve Moore was asked directly if there's significant information the FBI knows about this investigation that the public doesn't. His answer was nuanced. He said, if they had significant information, they'd have more progress on the case. But he also said, if you could get briefed by the agents working it, you'd find a massive amount of information that seemed promising but led nowhere. Dead ends, false leads, evidence that doesn't connect. That's the reality of investigations like this. Most of what investigators learn doesn't make it into the final narrative. It's noise. It's clutter. It's the tedious work of eliminating possibilities until only the truth remains. But that process takes time, and it requires cooperation, and it demands that everyone involved prioritizes the victim over everything else. In this case, it's not clear that happened. There's been a lot of focus throughout this story on the sheriff and his decisions, on the reality show, on the leadership changes, on the evidence delays, and that focus is deserved, because these aren't minor administrative details. These are choices that directly impacted the investigation into a kidnapping and likely murder. But let's not lose sight of who the real victim is here. Nancy Guthrie was 70 years old. She lived in a quiet neighborhood. She had a life, a family, friends, a community. She deserved to feel safe in her own home. She deserved to grow old without fear. She deserved a competent, focused investigation when she was taken. Instead, her case became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when politics and ego infect law enforcement, when elected officials prioritize their careers over their duties, when experienced people are punished for not supporting the right candidate, when cooperation between agencies breaks down, when volunteers are ignored, when a reality show gets more attention than a missing woman. Nancy Guthrie deserved better. And the questions remain. Who took her? Was it one person or more? Where is she now? What does the FBI know that they haven't shared? Will the DNA from the hair evidence lead to a suspect? Will one of the kidnappers eventually break and talk? Will there ever be justice? 86 days in, we don't have those answers. But we do know this. The people responsible for finding those answers have not done everything they could have done. They have not prioritized Nancy Guthrie above their own interests. They have not cooperated fully. They have not accepted help when it was offered. And that failure, that institutional failure, may be the reason this case remains unsolved. Steve Moore said it best. If the experienced people were still in charge of homicide and cold case, we'd be in a different place now. Maybe not solved, but way farther down the road. That's not speculation. That's the assessment of someone who has worked these cases at the highest level. Someone who knows what competent investigation looks like. The absence of that competence, the removal of that expertise, the decisions made by a sheriff who appears more interested in television cameras than in solving crimes. These are not abstract failures. They have real consequences. And Nancy Guthrie paid the price. Before we wrap up, I want to remind you that True Crime Files is committed to staying on cases like this. Cases that fall out of the headlines. Cases where powerful people would rather we move on and forget. If you value this kind of in-depth investigation, if you think these stories need to be told, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're not going anywhere. We're staying on this case until there are answers. So where do we go from here? The FBI continues to work. The hair evidence is being tested. Agents are following leads. They're building a case, even if we can't see it happening. They're waiting for the break that solves it. That break might come from DNA. It might come from someone talking. It might come from a piece of evidence we don't even know exists yet. Or, it might not come at all. Some cases go cold. Some kidnappers are never caught. Some families never get closure. That's the brutal reality of crime and investigation. Not every story has a satisfying ending. Not every villain faces justice. But this case isn't cold yet. 86 days is a long time, but it's not forever. The FBI doesn't give up. They keep working. They keep pressure on. They keep hoping that someone involved will make a mistake or develop a conscience. And there's reason to believe that if multiple people were involved, one of them will eventually crack. Steve Moore was confident about that. The pact to stay silent won't hold. Someone's risk tolerance will break. Someone will decide prison time with cooperation is better than a life sentence for murder. Someone will talk. When that happens, the case will break open. Arrests will be made. The full story will come out. We'll learn what really happened to Nancy Guthrie, where she was taken, how she died, who was responsible. And then the questions will shift from what happened to why it took so long to find out. Why experienced investigators weren't in charge. Why evidence wasn't tested immediately. Why volunteers were ignored. Why the sheriff prioritized a reality show over a woman's life. Those are the questions that should haunt everyone involved in this investigation. Because Nancy Guthrie didn't just disappear. She was failed. Failed by a system that should have protected her. Failed by leaders who should have prioritized her. Failed by decisions that should never have been made. 86 days later, her family is still waiting. The community is still watching. And somewhere out there, the people responsible for her death are still free. But if there's one thing we know about investigations like this, it's that secrets don't stay buried forever. Someone always talks. Something always surfaces. The truth always finds a way out. The question isn't if this case will be solved. It's when, and whether the people who failed Nancy Guthrie will be held accountable, not just for her death, but for the failures that let her killers remain free for so long. We'll be here when that happens. We'll be here to tell that story. And we'll be here to make sure Nancy Guthrie is remembered not as a cautionary tale about institutional dysfunction, but as a person who deserved justice and finally got it. If you want to stay updated on this case and others like it, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Files. Hit that like button. Share this video. Keep Nancy's story alive. Keep the pressure on. Keep demanding answers. Because 86 days is too long, and every day that passes without justice is another day the system fails. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for refusing to let cases like this disappear into the darkness. This is True Crime Files, and we'll see you in the next investigation.